So, in some ways, what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is both the beginning, maybe and the end of this meeting, but to avoid too much jumping up and down, I'm going to do a bunch of it first. And the main part of what I want to talk to you about is the ways in which some communities in upstate New York have responded to the fracking issue. But to sort of get why that's happening, you have to understand some of the impacts of fracking. And to understand that, you have to know a little bit about what I'm even talking about when I say fracking. Now, a lot of details of that are being covered by the speakers coming after me, but there's a little bit that you do need to understand. So, HVHF, or high volume hydraulic fracturing, or as I'm sure Ingraffea will call it, multi-stage, slick water, hydraulic fracturing on long laterals, is different than the kind of gas drilling that's taken place in upstate New York and elsewhere across the country prior to this time. The first thing to understand is it's a lot bigger. Okay? Any one well will take millions of gallons of water to frack the well. And that's about 100 times at least more than traditional fracturing of gas wells. Also, because you have these very long, unless you've been asleep for the last few years, you realize that what we're talking about are wells that go down and then turn sideways and go horizontally through the ground. And because these wells are so much longer, that's why they take so much more water, also a lot more comes out. And so you've got a lot more drill cutting, more stuff to dispose of when the well is drilled. But in addition, because of all that water, because of all the chemicals that are put down the hole, because of all the equipment you need to run the darn thing, the site where this takes place is also a lot larger. So everything about it is bigger and a lot bigger. The other thing to understand is you will hear the statement made, well, we've been fracking wells for 60 years, which is true, but it means that depends on what you mean by fracking. This kind of fracking, this slick water, multi-stage fracking with long laterals, has only been done by the late 90s and really has been widespread use for only about 10 years. So this is not something we've been doing for decades and decades. It has a long, safe track record. And finally, it's being done in shale beds, which in general are widespread. And that means the drilling can take place anywhere in a region. And indeed does take place in many places in the region as the gas companies are trying to figure out the hot spots in the shale field. And so one big difference is it takes place pretty much everywhere over a wide swath of the region. So all of these things mean that gas drilling with this kind of high volume hydraulic fracturing has a much bigger impact on communities. I'm going to talk about a couple of these areas, and the other speakers are going to address some other ones. So first off, a guy named Jeffrey Jacquette went out and did a study out west in Sublette County, Wyoming, and sort of said, this kind of drilling was taking place out there, and he wanted to do sort of a sociological survey of what was happening in the community. And here's what he found. Basically, the folks who had been there before this came were less happy. Probably because they knew how wonderful it was before the drilling came to town. And there were a lot of people, because this kind of drilling, again, it's big, it's happening everywhere. All of a sudden, there's a huge influx of new folks and typically transient workers to a region. We'll talk more about the transient nature of the job a little bit later. And as a consequence of that, there were price increases, particularly in housing and rental housing, but in every commodity you can imagine, prices rose. There were increased demands on public services like ambulance runs, and there were more arrests and other social issues and problems in the society. That was a study done, again, out west. Now, you could have seen this coming, and what it tends to happen is people say, well, it's not going to happen here. We're going to have the right rules or write something to make sure it doesn't happen here. But it happened out there, and it's happening right now in Pennsylvania. So I live next to a guy who likes to race cars. I don't know why, but he likes to race cars. And he goes down to Pennsylvania and is doing this amateur car racing. And he told me, he came back, and I was talking to folks down in Pennsylvania, and here's what they told me. It's that between the heavy truck traffic, the water pulled in the river, and the prostitution and gambling that moved in with the crews, gas drilling has drastically impacted the area. This is kind of a bull in a china shop. It's not some minor little thing that moves into a community. Because it's widespread, because it's big, because it tends to happen fast, it's a bull in a china shop. Also in Pennsylvania, a while back, a number of officials from Tompkins County went down and spoke to officials in Bradford County. It was one of the most heavily drilled in so far in Pennsylvania with shale wells. And we've got some of these comments that, again, because housing prices go up, because there's rental housing is taken up often like temporary gas cleaning workers, folks who've been living there get displaced. And that means often the children wind up in foster care. Similarly, again, arrests go up, jails get overcrowded, those kind of problems. So those are some of the social problems. And again, I have a brief few moments here, so I'm not going to cover everything that takes place. But the other big thing, you might say, well, maybe it's worth it if this is going to be the boon of the economy that we're all counting on. And you'll hear a lot of talk about, well, if gas drilling comes, there's going to be X jobs, there's going to be so much more money. Well, let's take a look at what's really happened someplace. Okay, let's look at some of the real-world data. So, again, a group here called Headwaters Economics did a study out west, and a lot of this drilling occurred first out west. Some of the first data we had is from out west. Took a look at the last few decades worth of economic performance in various otherwise comparable counties, rural counties out west, some of whom had focused more heavily on gas drilling and oil extraction as their economic drivers, and others that did not. And here's roughly what they found. That basically those who focused on energy extraction did less well in the long run. They may do better in certain short-term circumstances, but long run, they had less diversity in their economies, they grew more slowly, there's a bigger gap in high and low incomes, the workforce wasn't as well educated, and they had less ability to attract folks to come live there. Right? Retirees, folks who can bring money into the community. Surprise, surprise, didn't want to move in next door to as well. And so they found overall that those factors hurt the economic growth in those energy-focused counties. Okay, let's take a look at our neighbor here in Pennsylvania. Now, one thing I want you to understand is these kind of negative economic results aren't that surprising if you realize that when gas drilling comes in, it's not just the money gas drilling is bringing in, maybe the jobs and the royalties and everything else, but it's a balance sheet. There are other businesses you can easily think of, bed and breakfast, tourist agencies, tourist businesses, wineries, that sort of stuff, might not do as well. So it's the pluses and minuses that they accounted for, and when the gas company comes to town, they don't tell you about the minus part. The other thing to understand is that there are a lot of jobs involved with gas drilling for a little while. Those jobs tend to be short-term while the drilling is taking place, and they tend to follow the rigs around. They don't stay in the community. The jobs that stay in the community, the ones that are tied to the well, are few and far between, maybe one job for every 6 wells. So as far as an economic driver in terms of employment, again, it's a flash in the pan, nothing long-term. So in Pennsylvania, again, the comments from the Bradford County officials was, actually a lot of businesses are hurting because there's so much truck traffic on the roads. It's such a hassle getting where people aren't going to businesses downtown anymore. Similarly, people, a researcher at Penn State, Fire Extension, took a look at what's happening to some of the dairy farms in the area. And this data is hard to get at the real level of why is this one farmer or that one farmer making different decisions. But in the aggregate, looking county by county, the more drilling there was in the county, the less well they were doing in terms of dairy production. So overall for the state, there was a slight increase in dairy production over the last few years, but as the number of wells per county went up, there was a decline in both the number of dairy cows, the number of dairy production, to the point where in the most heavily drilled counties, dairy production was down about 18%. So, you're getting money in out one door, but it's going out the other, not to mention the money that the towns would have to spend to fix the roads, house the criminals, and that kind of stuff. So, again, there are a lot of claims out there about how great this is. There's a lot of noise made about how many jobs are created in Pennsylvania by the gas companies. When an economic agency, the Keystone Research Center, went to look for those jobs, they found about 1/5 the number of jobs that actually been created the industry was claiming. And one of the reasons for that is that if they fire somebody one month and hire somebody the next month, that's a job they've created, even though they're employing the same number of people. There are many reasons for this. So, it's no surprise, then, with some of these social problems, some of these economic problems, that maybe some communities in upstate New York are trying to say, we don't want to have this party take place in our neck of the woods. But it's not an easy issue. And I'm going to be the first one to say that. I've been talking to groups about this for several years now. Because our beautiful farms, our beautiful country land, hides a few things. There are a lot of folks who own large acreage, nice farms, who are might call land rich, but money poor. It's not easy to make a living farming these days. And there's a lot of rural poverty out there that's hidden by these bucolic scenes. Folks who have neither land nor money, who are really struggling to make a go, they're looking for any way to earn a buck. And then there are sort of ideological issues. There are those who say property rights. You don't have a right to tell me what I can or can't do on my property. I can drill for gas if I want to. But the reality is that property rights in this country have never been unfettered. Because one has never had the right to do something on your property that negatively impacts your neighbors. Not since George Washington cut down the apple tree. And you can do that in this country. So the question really is, we know some folks want it and some don't. How do we negotiate between those different interests? For example, we all have different levels of risk tolerance. Maybe someone's willing to run the risk of a problem occur and somebody else isn't. So how do we decide about whether we take a risk or not? So there's a common resource. To the extent that gas uses up clean air and clean water, is that appropriate that benefit is going to a few individuals or a few companies? And how do we decide that? Well, this actually is a political decision. And so I give you the sort of non-revolutionary statement that it should be the residents of a community who have the right to decide what it's like to live in their community. And luckily, New York State has this principle basically that land use decisions are local decisions. Land use decisions are made by the lowest level of government in your towns. And fortunately for us, given the way this country is going these days, that level of government is still responsive to what the people actually want. So I'm going to tell you, because you may have heard otherwise, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, towns have the right to decide whether or not they have gas drilling. Towns have the right to ban gas drilling. There have been 3 court cases about this. They're all, so far, lower-level court cases. The driving case and middle case are going to be appealed by the gas companies. Actually, one by a gas company, one by a landowner. There have been 3 different judges in 3 different jurisdictions who have all upheld the principle that in New York State, land use decisions are the proper jurisdiction of the local government. But I need to explain that slightly to make you understand the difference between a land use decision and a regulation. What towns cannot do is say, well, we'd like a little bit of gas drilling, maybe a few wells a year would be okay. You can't do that. That's called a regulation of the industry, and that is reserved by the state for the DEC. Towns cannot say, we'd like the wells to be super far from our schools. That's a regulation. The DEC can say that, but the town government can't. Towns can't say, we don't mind the old kind of gas drilling, we just don't want this hydraulic fracturing stuff. Towns can't say that. What towns can do is say yes or no. It's a rather blunt instrument, but it's the only instrument that Albany has left to the towns. So what towns can do is say, yes, we'll allow gas drilling of any kind, or no, we won't. And that has led to a ban and moratorium movement in this state. So here's a map made by Karen Edelstein showing sort of the snapshot of a few weeks ago as to what was what and where. So the pink is where towns have passed a moratorium. And I have to tell you, a moratorium is a temporary stay in action. There's never been any question that towns have a right to pass a moratorium on anything, because towns always have a right to say, whoa, we need some time to get our house in order before this goes forward. And absolutely, if your town does not have a plan for how to site industrial facilities, if your town does not have a plan for how you're going to recoup expenses from road damage and bridge damage, if your town does not have a plan about how to protect the water resources and other important resources of the town, by all means, have a moratorium. What's the reason not to? All you're doing is getting ready. But a number of towns have gone further than that and said, we're going to ban this practice. Again, the state gives us no other choice. We can say yes or no. We're going to say no, because we don't think the costs are worth it. You're going to hear more about the costs from the speakers coming after me. The yellow is folks that are still working on things. Okay, so this is a state, this is in flux. So I'm going to explain some of that process by giving the story of my own hometown, Carolina. And what happens in many communities is exactly what's happening here. First, a few folks get together and start teaching each other a few things about dog fraction that aren't the gas company line. They start digging on the internet and they start learning and realizing this, what I'm hearing is not exactly true. And then they start having meetings like this, bringing in outside experts to teach them, again, more than just the company line. So that's that green part there of the public outreach that we did in my town in Caroline. So prior to that was all the self-education and that kind of thing. And then, for a good year, we were holding public meetings, having movies, that kind of stuff. But it became apparent to us that what we needed to do was take the pulse of our community. And some of this first happened in Ulysses and Dryden. So we said, we need to get out on the streets and talk to people and find out really what our community thinks and feels about gas drilling, and also do what we can to get information out there so they're not just hearing the ads on TV about gas drilling. And so we did that. We planned a campaign to go out petitioning, and we went out petitioning there for about 6 to 8 months in the middle of 2011. And I have to tell you that petitioning, going door to door, was one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in my life. I was knocking on doors and talking, in some cases, to neighbors I'd never met, people I've lived next to for years. Another time to go all the way across the town, meeting new folks I'd have no reason to otherwise have met. And the look of hope in their eyes, and the gladness with which they said, I'm so glad you're doing this, was heartwarming. Because up to this time, everyone had told them, you can't stop this. It's going to happen no matter what you do. You might as well sign a lease. And we were the first ones to be able to tell them, no, that's not true. That's the gas company story. There is a way out. Now, this was before the decisions in Dryden and Middlefield that confirmed what we were saying. But, the legal thinking seems solid that the towns have a right to say no. And so we brought this hope out there. And I went to those people who were land rich and money poor. Okay? And some of them signed the petition, some of them didn't. And I went to those people who were land poor and money poor. And you know what? Almost every single one of them signed the petition. Because they realized there wasn't anything in gas drilling for them. Except higher prices, higher rents, higher food costs, and little chance of much reward because they only owned a few acres of land. So we did that, and I'm going to show you some results. And after the summer, by the end of the summer, in September, we brought what we had found to our town board in a presentation, and about a month later, then there was a town board meeting. We'll talk about it in a minute. So here's roughly what we found when we went to our community. So that's a map of Caroline there on your left, and all the red dots are houses we went to. We knocked on essentially every door in the town of Caroline. We didn't always get people home, and so we wound up reaching maybe 2/3 of the actual households that we actually spoke to someone at one time or another. And that's all the red dots, all the places we actually talked to somebody at one time or another. And then the panel on the right tells you what we found. Okay? So basically, again, I should tell you that Caroline's very rural, not too unlike here. There are no cities. We have some hamlets. A total of 3,000 people, 2,100 or so adults in our town. And so the results here are scaled to the number of adults. So it's not like there's some huge city that all these votes are from. We went everywhere in town. And we found support everywhere in town for having a ban. And so roughly 71% of the residents we approached agreed that there should be a ban in Caroline. And having presented this to the town board at their next meeting, the town board decided 3-2 to do nothing about the issue of gas drilling. Which tells you something about at least the bravery and steadfastness of those who were on our town board in their stubbornness. So that was October 4th, 2011. A month later, there were elections. 2011, odd year, we had elections for the town board. The two of the votes that said we're not going to do anything about gas drilling were up for re-election, and both of them were defeated by two candidates who said, we want to do something about gas drilling. And so suddenly, everything changed. Starting in January, the new town board took office. A few months later, they passed a moratorium for the express purpose of taking care of some things like the industrial site plan review, protecting the roads, that kind of thing, and also to give the town to think about whether or not they want to institute a ban. Then began working on a ban. And that nice, smooth little green bar there, working on a ban, does not even begin to tell you how much work and how many meetings and how, at times, tempestuous that process was. So there were at least a couple information sessions at which the ban and the steps about it were explained to the public, and they could ask questions to make sure they understood what was going on and inject ideas of how to maybe change that. Then there were at least 2, if not 3, other work sessions that occurred in which the town board was working on the language of the ban and take the public comment working on that. And then finally there was a public hearing. This is a land use ordinance that took an actual public hearing. And all that took place with that green ban, the green bar there. And then finally, on September 11th, of just a little while ago, the board voted 4-1 into the ban. So there you have it. The choice is yours. You don't have to have a ban. You don't have to allow gas drilling. You don't have to disallow gas drilling. But the choice is for those of you who live here. It's not the choice of gas companies whether or not they drill for gas here. It shouldn't be the choice of just a few people who own the most land. That's a feudal society. This is a democratic ideal that is a process you go through by talking to each other and talking to your town board to decide what's the right course for our community.